Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ask the Expert webinar using SAS with Microsoft 365, a programming approach. My name is Alice Yuan, and I will serve as your moderator for today's event. Now, I would like to take a moment to introduce our presenter, Chris Hemmedinger, Director of SAS User Engagement. Chris leads a team that manages SAS online communities, SAS user groups, developer experience, and GitHub, tech newsletters, expert webinars, and tutorials. Chris is a recovering software developer who helped build popular SAS products such as SAS Enterprise Guide and is the author of SAS for Dummies. With all of that out of the way, why don't we turn things over to Chris so we can get started. Chris, please take it away.
All right, thank you, Alice, and hello, everybody. It's great to see you here on the webinar. I've just been scrolling through the list of attendees. I recognize a lot of names here, so thank you for coming out and tuning in for your interest on this topic. Speaking of this topic, let's review exactly what we're going to be talking about here. Many of us are using Microsoft 365 as a key productivity tool within our enterprises. And along with SAS, we have a need to integrate these two enterprise tools to help them work together. So what we're talking about here is a way to connect your SAS session to your Microsoft 365 content using SAS code. We're going to go through the nuts and bolts of how you can get that done. If your use case is different, if what you really need to do is connect your Microsoft 365 applications to your SAS content, flipping it on its side, for example, you need to get to your SAS content from Microsoft Excel or PowerPoint or something like that, then we have a product for you called SAS for Microsoft 365 that's present in SAS Viya. So if you are pulling content from SAS into your Microsoft 365 apps, that's probably the approach you want. If instead you are, like me, have a lot of SAS code that needs to be able to access things like Excel content or publish content from a SAS job into a SharePoint folder or OneDrive or a Teams folder, then that's what we're covering here. The reason that we are even talking about this is because many of us as SAS users are used to reading and writing Microsoft Office documents using SAS. For example, reading in Excel files as input into a SAS process using proc import or livename XLSX just to read it in. And we're used to having those files locally on our PCs or maybe on a network share where we can just easily read them into SAS. Or we're use SAS to create a lot of insights that we need to share with the organization, and we create those insights in a format that is easy for others to consume, such as an Excel-based report or a Word document or something like that. Well, with Microsoft 365 and its environment in the cloud, all those files that we're used to being able to read and write directly from our local drives or our network shares, those are no longer accessible to us in the ways that they used to be. And so we have to use a different mechanism to access them. And that's where Microsoft 365 is super capable in allowing us to do that. But the way that we do that is through REST APIs. And in SAS, we have a special way to deal with REST APIs to access them and leverage their power, and that's using proc HTTP. So, and we use that with the Microsoft 365 offers this thing called the Microsoft Graph API as our interface into doing that. And that allows us to move content back and forth between these two ecosystems in a way that's seamless and still allows us to get our work done with SAS. Now, that's the most common use case that lots of people come to me with is I have my Excel files out in the cloud and I need to get them into SAS or vice versa. But I want to talk about a couple of other use cases, ones that we actually use here at SAS that are important for our own productivity. This is an example of a process that we've recently implemented here, and I know a lot of SAS users also have, as they've adopted the Microsoft 365 ecosystem. They have other low-code tools like Power Automate, where they can set up processes that move information along in a specific way or trigger certain events based on data. And of course, a lot of times that data is generated in SAS. And so you need to hook these things up so that they can, so that your SAS process can result in something that will trigger something in a Microsoft Power Automate flow. The example we have here at SAS is how we onboard our own employees in our online communities. We gather data from our community platform in SAS, and we have a SAS data set that we then turn in. We want to push that up to Power Automate in order to then trigger an email that welcomes the SAS employee into our community and lets them know what they can do as an employee in our community platform. So the way we do that is we create an Excel file, and then we push that Excel file using the techniques I'm going to show you into a SharePoint folder, which then is the input into a Power Automate flow that then results in sending an email automatically to the person who just joined the community. It's all seamless. It runs every day. It doesn't require any intervention from us once it's all set up. Another example, which is going to be maybe near and dear to Alice's heart here, is this is a little bit meta, but as we run this successful Ask the Expert webinar program, we generate reports that tend to be in Excel files, and we store all of these in SharePoint. Every webinar has a report, and we store it in SharePoint, and sometimes we want to report on the group of these. And so we have a SAS process that can go out to SharePoint, download all of those Excel files, import them into SAS, and then aggregate them together and create a report where then we can report on the overall health of our webinar program. This is a great reminder for you that one of the big inputs into these reports is your feedback. So at the end of the webinar, I would love for you to complete the survey and say how you would like to, or your suggestions for other topics, and give us that feedback. It really helps us to shape this program. As I mentioned, the whole mechanism that we use to do this is leveraging the Microsoft Graph APIs. And this is a very simple example of what this looks like in SAS code. Once I have access to the Graph APIs, I can do, there's so many different things that these APIs allow you to do. This simple example is just retrieving the data within the Microsoft 365 ecosystem about me in my logged in profile. And you can see here in SAS code, issuing that API call, getting a response in JSON. So proc HTTP sends a call out there to the API. I get a response that's JSON formatted, and then I can use a live name JSON mechanism to read that into SAS as data. This is a very simple example. They get more complex the more kinds of things that you want to do. But this is what is really happening behind the scenes. As part of exploring all of these techniques, I encourage you to learn more about the Microsoft Graph APIs. There's great, very comprehensive documentation from Microsoft. Links are in here in the slides, which you will have access to later. But there's a Microsoft Graph API documentation, a complete reference of everything that you can do in the API and how those work with samples. And then you can actually try these APIs yourself in a Microsoft provided tool called the Microsoft Graph Explorer. This gives you hands-on access to, so you can see the kinds of calls that you can make running against your own data and see what kinds of responses you're getting. It's really important to understand how these APIs are working before you try to implement them in SAS so that you can craft your SAS process in a way that you know exactly what you're calling and what to expect back in terms of a response. So let's talk about what is required in order to connect SAS to Microsoft 365. Well, there's a few steps to get started. One is we need to create a way for you as a user to connect to Microsoft 365, to your specific instance of or tenant of your Microsoft 365 ecosystem. And to do that, what you do is you register what's called a new client application. It's basically just adding an identifier for an app, and I'm air quoting here the app, because the app is just basically just an identifier that allows you to connect with a certain set of permissions to be able to accomplish the things you want to accomplish. Once you have that app registered, and really only one person in your organization needs to do that, and multiple people can use the same app, then each individual who needs to access it can obtain an authorization code. So there are some. Let me just advance here a little bit. So one time per organization, you create that application. One time per person, you get an authorization code. These are steps that need to be done manually. They're not automatable, but the good news is you only need to do them once. And I'll show you examples of how this is done. Once you have your app that you're connecting to and your authorization code, and after your first access, you receive a token, an access token. This is the key that you would be passing to the API every time that you need to run it, and that can be done all automated. So, for example, you set these things up manually first, and then every day or every month or whatever the frequency is, you can use your access token and refresh it to get access again and use the APIs then to do all the things that you need to do, whether it's navigate your folders, retrieve and publish files. So for example, in my use cases that I talked about earlier, those just run every day. They don't need anything from me. I don't have to do anything manual. I manually set them up at the beginning to get my authorization code, but now everything just runs behind the scenes in batch. The process for registering a client app it's simple, but you may need help from your IT organization or whoever it is in your organization that maintains your Microsoft 365 tenant. You go to the Azure portal, which is usually portal.azure.com, and you navigate to the applications list, and then you create a new application. So as I mentioned earlier, one registered app can serve all of the users in your organization, and so only really one person in your organization needs to do this. You need to, at the time that you're creating this app, you're also going to register the kinds of permissions that it needs to do the work that you need to do. For most of us, the permissions are things like, I need to be able to read and write my OneDrive files. I need to be able to read and write my SharePoint files, which are also my Microsoft Teams files. Those are usually the sufficient permissions we need. The kinds of permissions that we are associating here are called delegated permissions. That means that once I connect to the API using my personal access token, all of the actions that are taking place as me. That means the API is acting on my behalf. It can only access the kinds of files, the exact files that I have access to. It doesn't give me any additional permissions to get to any other content or publish to areas where I wouldn't normally have permissions. The keys that you're going to need from your app as you register it is you're going to need to make note of what's called the client ID, which is the specific app ID for the thing that you've registered, and your tenant ID, which will be the overall global tenant ID for everybody in your organization. Once you've registered all of that and you've got a tenant ID and a client ID, you're going to need to be able to access that parts of the information from within your SAS program. And I've got some SAS macros, which I will be demonstrating a little bit later on, that make this a lot easier than it would be if you were just doing it manually. But of course, you can take the information that I'm sharing here and do it all manually if you want to. My goal here is to show you how to do the most common things with a minimum of coding. And the whole process of again, registering the app and the authorization code. I'm not going to show it during this session, but I do have a video that's on our SAS community that shows the whole process from start to finish demonstrated. And so it's one of the resources that you'll have a link to after this presentation, is you can watch that video and see exactly how it is done. So once I have my information about my tenant ID and my client ID, what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically create this as a piece of information that I'm going to store into a file, a configuration file, and then I'm going to use these SAS macros that I've developed in order to read that information in and start to get my my access code. Once I have that those configuration pieces of information in place, I can use these macros to generate an authorization URL, and then that authorization URL, I'm going to visit that while signed in, and then get the access codes I need. So what that looks like is once I paste that URL into a browser while I'm signed in, I may be prompted to grant permissions to this app that I've registered to do the things that I've told it needs to be able to do, such as read and write my OneDrive files and read and write my SharePoint files. You've probably seen this grant permissions application kind of window before when connecting other apps to other kinds of services, whether it's Microsoft 365 or some other cloud-based service where you're using a sign-in to connect to a service, and it's saying, hey, this app wants to connect as you want it to let it, do you want to let it do these things? And then you accept those permissions, and then you're able to move on. In this case, moving on means you're going to get an access code, and that code is going to appear inside the URL of the page that results from you visiting this this address, and you're going to copy that access code out of that URL field and use it in a subsequent step. Now, you might run into a message like this, which is you need to consult. It means you need to consult with your IT or whoever's maintaining your tenant for additional permissions. It means that they need to do a step in order to grant your application the ability to be accessed in this way. This is the way it works at our organization, and it's something that is done frequently enough that our IT actually has a whole request form for how to do this, because it is something that lots of people have legitimate business needs for. So it's a great, it's a good opportunity to build a relationship with your IT organization. You have a business need in order to be able to accomplish this stuff using your SAS investment to get to your Microsoft 365 investment. It only makes sense, and hopefully you're able to do this. Once you have your authorization code, again, we're going to leverage these macros that I've developed in order for you to just basically paste this into a SAS program, and then which will then make an API call that's going to actually generate the access token for you. So the authorization code is like your initial key that you're turning in order to get an access token, which is what you're going to use in your subsequent API calls. As a result of this, you're going to have information that is going to be stored in your ecosystem. You're going to have this config file that has, again, that information about your tenant ID and your app ID, and then you're going to have this token.json file, which is basically that access token, which is like a password. It's like credentials, and you have to manage this responsibly as you would manage any credentials. What I advocate and what I do is I home these files inside a folder that only I have access to. So it's a private place on my PC. If I'm managing on my PC, it's a private place if I'm on a Linux system, I create a hidden folder that only I have read permissions to. I use chmod command to make sure that only I can see it. Or if I'm using SAS Via and putting it into a SAS content folder, which my macros do support, then I put it in a content folder that only I can see. There was a question earlier, and it's come up a couple of times. What if I want to maintain these things in some kind of secret server like HashiCorp or something like that? I'm sure that's definitely possible. I don't have a ready example of that in action, but it's something that I'm definitely interested in developing. And when and if I get to that, I will definitely be sharing that out. I've already plugged a couple of times the SAS macros that you can be using to help with all of this. And I'm going to demonstrate them in just a moment. But these are the main tasks that these macros will help you do. And again, you don't have to use these macros in order to do this. I'm showing you the techniques that you would use to connect SAS to Microsoft 365 API. But the macros I've built are meant to encapsulate the most common things that people want to do and make those things a little bit easier. So that's getting help with your initial authorization code, managing your access token credentials, and then doing the actual actions that people most often want to do, like list the contents of the items in my OneDrive folders and files, list the content of my SharePoint site, folders and files, download files. That's something I need to do. I need to download from those folders if I want to import them into SAS, download them into my SAS session so that SAS can read them, or take files I've generated in SAS and upload them into OneDrive or SharePoint for sharing later. The macros that I'm talking about here are all stored in this GitHub project that I'm showing up here. And so the URL is up there at the top. Okay, well, let's get into the demo here and show what this looks like in action. Now, all the techniques that I'm showing you here work in any SAS environment that you might have. So it works in SAS 9, most recently SAS 9.4. It works in SAS Via. And it doesn't matter what interface you're using. If you're using Enterprise Guide or just base SAS on Windows or SAS Studio, whether that's SAS Studio that's on SAS 9 or SAS Studio in SAS Via, it doesn't matter. You can use any SAS environment for this, and you don't need any additional licensed software from SAS to make it work. It's just using base SAS code. In my case here for my demo, I'm going to be using the VS Code SAS extension. So I love VS Code as a way, adding to my tool belt of ways to use SAS. I also love using this special feature supported by the SAS extension for VS Code called SAS Notebooks. It allows me to mix documentation and explanations with code and then run them cell by cell to show you how it all works. The VS Code extension is also one of the basis of the experience behind SAS Via Workbench, which is a product that was released just a few weeks ago. And if you're interested in that, I encourage you to watch the webinar we had recently about that one. So first thing I'm going to do here in my VS Code is I'm going to be using my local SAS server. I just have SAS installed locally, but I could be using a remote SAS Via or another SAS 9 server. I'm just going to sign in to my SAS, which just launches my local SAS server. And then once it's signed in, that is my SAS server is started, you'll see over here on the right, I've got access to my SAS libraries. So the first step here that I'm going to do is I'm going to access these macros that I've been talking so much about. They are stored in GitHub, and I don't have them installed locally in this environment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a little step that's just going to go get them from where they live in GitHub out on the internet and bring them into my SAS session. And then I'm going to %include them so that I have the macros available for calling. So I've just ran this cell here, and you can see the log shows me everything, all that worked. My next step is to tell these macros where my configuration home is. So what's the folder where I'm going to be storing that config.json file and where I want ultimately my token.json file to live. As I mentioned earlier, this is what the JSON, the config.json file would look like. Just substituting in your own information for your tenant ID and your client ID. And then I'm going to use this init config macro call to tell the macros where are these files going to be. So in this case, I've just installed them locally on my PC. So I'm going to run it here. These could be part of my SAS content folders if I'm using SAS Via. That's supported. That's something I added just recently. If I'm using them in SAS content, then I have to add a little flag here saying that's where they are, because the way that you access SAS content is a little different than just accessing normal files. But it is something that is supported. So there, I've initiated this configuration, which means I've just read that config.json file into my SAS session. All right. The next step, if I'm doing this for the first time, I would have to go and get that initial access code by visiting that authorization URL. And so this macro here, the generate auth URL, will basically put that information together and generate the URL that you would visit. So as you can see here in the SAS log, it's generated this kind of long URL that I would just copy and paste into my browser, and then that would sign me into my Microsoft 365 and generate an auth code for me that I would then copy into the next step here, which is just pasting it here into my program, and then calling the get access token in order to actually generate the token. But I don't need to do that right now because I've already done this and I already have a token that I'm just going to be refreshing. So I'm not going to run that step. Instead, since I've already got my token.json in my local config, I'm going to initiate my Microsoft 365 session here. So I'm just going to run this. So this macro, what it does is it goes ahead and it refreshes my access token. It makes an API call to authenticate with that token, and it generates a new access token that I can be using in all of my subsequent API calls. The access token will expire. It expires, I think it's like a 60-minute timeout. So plenty of time for me to get through this session and pretty much any kind of SAS session where I'd be doing this kind of work. Usually it's, I'm done, under a minute with whatever kinds of activities I'm doing. You can see that this succeeded here because my macro spits out a little message that says, okay, the token is refreshed, and here's when it expires. Now, yeah, so it expires, yeah, here at 12:53, which is about an hour and a half from now. So now that I have that token, it is stored in a macro variable. I can start to make API calls to my Microsoft 365 instance. So here's that example one I showed earlier on a slide where I'm just going to call this simple one to just show my own profile within the ecosystem. And I'll just run this, and then I'll show you what the JSON return value is. I'm passing in OAuth bearer equals that access token. This is shorthand for basically putting in the authorization bearer token into this API call, which is part of how that mechanism works. Run this. And you can see in the log here, I've got my JSON with all my details here that's coming out of my corporate directory, part of the Microsoft 365 environment. Okay, now that I've shown I can connect and make API calls, let's look at some of these macro routines that do the most common things that people want to do. Let's say I want to list the contents of my my OneDrive. So I've got a macro here called list my drives, and it's going to create a data set called drives, which contains the information about my specific root folders on my OneDrive. The ones mostly I care about are documents. These other ones are things that are kind of back behind the scenes in the system. I don't really need to access those. If I go to what I need to do for subsequent calls though is I need to what I need to do is be able to pass in the unique identifier for the things I want to drill into. So in this case, I want to drill into my documents. The unique identifier is over here on line 3 on the left. It's a big long string. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use proc SQL to find that ID and store it in a macro variable that then I can use to list my folder items, starting with my drive ID, and then go and generate what are the top level items within my OneDrive documents folder. So let's just go ahead and run this. And you can see here now I've got the details of that this proc pint just prints the first 10 items, but you can see these are the top root folders and items I would see in my OneDrive if I was just looking on my in my OneDrive folder on my PC or online. It's stored in this work.paths output that I've designated. I'm just going to expand here, and you'll see I can just open that up here in the SAS extension, and you can see all the content here. Now, suppose I have I know I have a folder called projects within my OneDrive, and I want to, within that projects folder, I have an Excel file that I would like to download into my SAS session and import with proc import. So in this cell, what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the ID of that folder named projects coming from that paths data that I've just generated. And then I'm going to list the folder items within that to get the list of, okay, what are the items in here? This is where I would discover where I have my Excel files, the one I'm interested in. And then I'm going to use this download file macro, which is part of the library that I'm demonstrating here, to actually grab that file and bring it into my SAS session. Then with that file in my SAS session, just putting it into basically the work folder for the moment, a temporary space, I'm going to use proc import to read that and read it into SAS. And then we'll print the first few records of it. So let's just run this. So lots of stuff going on there. You saw it was generating lists of items and behind the scenes, and then doing a download. It did the download and then did the proc import. If I refresh my content over here on the right, you'll see the data that I just imported. It's here. It's called Excel data as designated in my proc import, and I can open that up as well just to view that. And you can see that there's the content there. Now, that's OneDrive. Now let's talk about SharePoint and Teams. So SharePoint, those of us who are working in SharePoint, you may know that Teams, if you have Teams folders, it's actually using SharePoint behind the scenes. So the mechanism is exactly the same, and it's very similar to what we're doing in OneDrive as well. So in this case, I have some SharePoint. I have our SAS SharePoint that I'm connecting to, and I have a Teams folder that's our communities team. This is the team that my team uses to do a lot of communication. And so in this case, I'm going to list those libraries within my team. I'm going to get the one called documents, and then I'm going to list the items within there just as a way of navigating. and you can see here, here's the items that are within the root of my Teams folder channel. And if I were to, again, refresh over here, you'll see the actual data set. That's in, again, I overwrote paths here, so it's just that content. Now, if I, let's say I want to do, I want to generate some content in SAS, and I want to share it into SharePoint. So first, let's run a little program here that's just going to generate an Excel file for me. So nothing to do with Microsoft 365 at this point. I'm just going to use ODS Excel to generate a little simple report that I'm going to store in an XLSX file. It will also create an HTML version of that report because that's what this SAS extension does. So we'll see it come out in the log here, or in the output. So you can see this is what that report would look like. Now that I've generated that file, I want to do some more navigation to find the right folder to store it in. So in this case, I'm going to list the items that are in my general folder in order to get the ID for the items that are within my in my examples folder, and then I'm going to execute the upload file macro that I've got that will actually share this file out into that SharePoint folder. So let's just run that. And here you can see in the log, it does a lot of work behind the scenes. One thing I will say about the upload macro is it's a complex orchestration of API calls, which I'll talk about in a minute. But you can see here I have successfully uploaded it, and if I go to the actual SharePoint view, so here I've got this is a view of this actual folder, my general examples folder in SharePoint. You can see it was modified. This file was modified just about a minute ago. If I were to open that up, you'll see I've got the content in here, exactly like the report you saw in my code view. And if I look at, because I've done this a few times, this file has been replaced a few times, and you can see it has a version history. So every time I upload it, it versions it for me. This is just how it works in SharePoint. So I can see exactly what's different here. So that's how that all works. Going back to the upload operation, there is a mechanism for uploading files in Microsoft 365 that has you creating an upload session. You have to upload especially large files in chunks. This is the way the API works, so that you're not sending one huge file across the wire in the API call. It just won't support that. So the macro has to split the file into multiple chunks, and then upload each of those chunks where they're reassembled on the other side. So these macros handle all of that for you, and make that process a whole lot simpler. Okay, going back to our slides here. Just to sum up, some of the things that are within this macro library that I just showed, you get some wrappers to help initialize your connection, your token, list things like in your OneDrive contents, list your SharePoint folders, upload files to SharePoint, download a file from SharePoint or OneDrive. So these are the helper methods that are all included in here. you can use them as is, or you can study this code as it's put together and adapt it for your own needs. And if you need to support other operations, I know we have a lot of customers and users who are interested in SharePoint lists or Microsoft 365 lists, which is a different kind of data item within the Microsoft 365 ecosystem. There are APIs to deal with those as well. So those can get a little complex because lists don't necessarily have a defined schema data structure. So your code has to deal with that, has to be a little bit more robust, but it's definitely possible to do, and we definitely have customers who are doing that. The rest of these slides just show examples of what I just showed you inside the demo session, but I'm including them here for completeness, so that when I show the slides later, you'll be able to review them. If you want to learn more about this topic, more than what I was able to cover here, I have a blog post that I've recently updated with some more information that's very easy to find. If you just Google SAS and Microsoft 365 or SAS and SharePoint, you'll probably find it, but we'll have links to those as part of the delivery here. And also on the SAS communities, I mentioned that video earlier, but also the archive of this webinar and ones I've done in the past. All the Q&A are included here. And whatever questions come in on this one, we'll be adding to those as well. So speaking of questions, I think there are a few. So let's get to them.
On to our first question. Here we have, hi Chris, how can we extend the expiry time frame of the token?
I don't think you can extend the expiry time frame for the token. The way it's meant to work is when you get the token, you get the access token that you can use immediately for the APIs, and you also get what's called a refresh token, which does not expire, and you can use at a later time. So the way this works, for example, if I today run a process that it will read that refresh token, use the API to get a new token that I can use immediately to call the APIs. It will also return me a refresh token. The refresh token is what then I would use, say, tomorrow or the next time to, again, get the token. So there's not a way for you as an end user to adjust the expiry time. I'm pretty sure of that. I'm not even sure that's something that your administrator can control. I don't know if that's a tenant controlled thing or not. It's just the way that Microsoft 365 works. You don't want a token that just sits out there forever. Because the longer it's alive, the more risk there is that somebody could use it for purposes that they shouldn't. So it's intentionally short term, and for a process such as this, most operations that you would be doing in a SAS session, if you're running them all sequentially, it should happen very quickly, and you shouldn't need the token to be alive for very long.
All right, thank you. Next question, the client application and authorization code. How do users find out if our organization is quote unquote registered? Can this be blocked by organizations?
So what I showed a little bit of before is you need this application within your Azure portal to be registered as an endpoint, a thing that you're connecting to. You might not be able to register it yourself, so it could be that your organization doesn't allow you to do that, and you'll have to ask for someone to do that for you, or ask for permission to do that. Or it could be that you're allowed to register it, but you're not allowed to actually activate it to do anything, in which case you need to get admin consent, again, provided by your IT organization. If your question is, how do I find out whether I've already got one? Well, if you don't know of one, with your colleagues who you're working with, who might also be using SAS for this, you can, if you have access to the Azure portal, You can search applications, so you can, if you know what they might be called by name, you can search the whole list of applications and maybe find it that way. But it's a good idea to be intentional, deliberate about, okay, what's the thing I'm connecting to? What permissions does it have? And again, those delegated permissions are key to be able to get the thing to behave, to basically have permission to do the things that you have permission to do. If you think your application needs more permissions of that, like I need to be able to do things that I don't normally have permission to do, that's a different kind of, that's a more of an application or admin only thing. Like I needed to be able to send email on my boss's behalf. Well, that's, that's going to get more scrutiny from the people who are providing this for you. So I've worked with a lot of customers who have who have successfully gotten this working in their organization. And if you stay within the boundaries of, I just need this to have the delegated permissions to do the thing that I needed to do, and there's a clear business need to have this capability, it's usually not been a problem.
Thank you. Next question, is this also available on the Microsoft GCC_high cloud?
I'm not sure what the GCC_high cloud is. I know there are different Microsoft clouds for different kinds of customers. For example, government customers may be using a different tenant, a different cloud hosting mechanism, or different countries may have different regional things that are restricted, which would adjust some of the URLs that you're using. And in my macro library that I'm sharing out, those things are all replaceable. So if your URLs are different than what you saw me use here, then it's pretty easy for you to swap those out. So the answer is generally, yes, everything I showed here should be available in whatever cloud you're using. The Microsoft 365 APIs are used by, they're used by a lot of the Microsoft applications themselves too. So they should be generally accessible. Just some of the URLs may be a little bit different.
All right, thank you. Next question, when setting up an APP, is there a client secret associated with the APP? If there is, does it need to be refreshed every once in a while?
Yeah, so when you're setting up an app, you have a client ID. No, you don't have a client secret, at least not in the mechanism that I show. Instead, you have this OAuth 2 mechanism that I showed where you are signing in as you, getting that access code. That's basically the secret for you that you then use to then turn into to get access tokens that you can use from then on. So it's not a app ID and client secret or client ID and client secret mechanism. Some APIs do have that kind of mechanism. This is not that. This is you got to go get this access code and turn that in for your token.
All right, thank you. Next question here. With SAS 9.4, are any modules needed to access the Microsoft 365 OneDrive or SharePoint?
No additional products or modules needed other than just Base. Everything I showed you here is just using Base. Proc HTTP is part of Base, and I didn't veer from any of that. So no.
Awesome. Next question. We currently use SAS Studio. Does this work in Studio or VIA only?
It works in SAS Studio. It works in VIA. It works in SAS 9. It works in any SAS environment where you're running code. You can, it works. I've tested it even in SAS On Demand for academics. It works. It can work there too, although you have to be a little bit careful with your credentials in any kind of public environment, obviously. So, but yes, it is platform agnostic. So wherever you're running a modern SAS environment, that is SAS 9.4, or any version of SAS Via, it should work fine.
Great, thank you. And next question here, could you please show a demo of a different output type, maybe PDF, of the report you created and exported into the XLXS workbook you previewed?
I'm not going to show that now. I don't really have time, but it works exactly the same way. If I created a PDF instead of, in my sample here, if I used ODS PDF instead of ODS Excel, it generated a PDF file, and then I could upload that into SharePoint in the exact same way. I'm just uploading a file. Any file that I want to upload to SharePoint would work. So the mechanism is exactly the same. Now, if I wanted to download a file, a PDF file, and do something with that in SAS, I'd have the complication of how do I read a PDF file in SAS, which is its own sort of problem set. But for data type things like an Excel file, which is very easy to read in SAS, that's a very common use case.
All right, thank you. Next question. We frequently use ODS Excel. Is there a method for updating an existing worksheet?
No, you can't update an existing worksheet with ODS Excel. You can, proc export is a mechanism that allows you to update an existing workbook, but the proc export only supports basically exporting SAS data as a new sheet or a replacement sheet. So for example, you could have an ODS Excel that you create, and then on one worksheet within your workbook, and then you could proc export data onto a different worksheet within that same workbook, so you can update it that way. But ODS Excel itself always creates a new Excel file. It cannot update an existing Excel file.
Thank you. Next question. If we needed assistance explaining to IT and answering their security questions, would we be able to get some support from SAS tech support? IT does not always welcome new processes with open arms.
No way. Well, this is time for you to bake a tray of muffins for your IT staff and get on their good side. I think from what I have seen in organizations, it's pretty clear to demonstrate a business need for doing this kind of thing, because it's the capability that we've traditionally had, but now it's more complicated because everything's in the cloud. But we still have that business need to be able to read and write content in our Microsoft Office ecosystem. So the tech support does answer a lot of questions about this mechanism. It's not a product exactly that they support, but it is a question, as they do often get questions on this, and they have a lot of information for helping. In terms of like, how do you talk to your IT? Like, how do you have that conversation? I do have some guidance in the blog post that I've shared, it's basically just, you have a business case. You have a kind of a limited scope of impact. You're not getting permission to do anything that you didn't already have permission to do via point and click. You just want to automate it with your SAS code. And so there's not a whole lot of additional exposure there. But yeah, sometimes it can be a challenge to get permission to do something that's a little bit off menu. But as I say, at least in our organization, the requests come up often enough that it's something that they're used to.
Thank you. Next question, what component should we need to access Microsoft 365 from SAS 9.4M8? And it's in brackets, Azure.
Again, nothing additional special. It's just base SAS. No additional components needed.
All right.
If you're running in Azure, if your SAS session is running in Azure, like in a hosted machine in Azure, I mean, that's fine. That doesn't necessarily get you any benefit, even though Microsoft 365 is in Azure, and if your SAS is in Azure, it's still two cloud applications that have to talk to each other with APIs.
All right. Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for questions today. Thank you, Chris, for all your answers, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. On behalf of myself, Chris, and all of SAS, we really hope that you enjoyed today's webinar. Thank you all and have a great rest of your day.